Bridge Capital, they were out to see us and basically said, we'll give you 2 to 3 year money so that you can deal with CMBS maturities, knowing that you can't fund into that marketplace. Now that the CMBS is returning, they'd like to get some of their money back. The spreads got very wide, and now they're getting very narrow. And there were very tough underwriting provisions, and now all of a sudden it's back to fun and games. The borrowers are using the put option implicit in any non-recourse debt, and we see a number of REITs. We haven't done this, but a number of our competitors have. They're using the put option, they're giving properties back. Basically, if the property's not cash flowing, they're saying, we don't know how long it's not going to be cash flowing. Let's just give the asset back, and they're giving them back to lenders. So what's the future direction? Just very quickly, REITs are growing in size and sophistication. The liquidity and the access to capital we have make us very powerful in the marketplace. REITs are increasing penetration into many different property markets, and in many different countries across the globe have some flavor of REIT now. That's going to make a very few interesting couple of years in my view, because as we hit the wall with penetration into various property markets, as a mall company, about 85% of the institutional malls in the US are already owned by the REITs. So it's very hard to find more assets. So what do? You have to grow some way. You either gobble each other up, or you start looking overseas, or you start getting into more property types. My prediction is we're going to see mergers across property types, which fits with the way that many communities want to see development occur. They'd like to see mixed use. They'd like to see increased density. They want to leverage the increasing infrastructure. So I think that's going to be reflected in REIT mergers. And the other thing is I think there's going to start to be cross-border M&A as real estate companies look to seek global scale. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Jason?
Hi, everyone. And special thanks to the CRE and to the MIT Sloan for having us. My name is Jason Liu. I'm here with AMCAP. AMCAP is a private equity real estate firm. We're based in Stamford, Connecticut, and we were founded in 1979. All of our work is in grocery-anchored retail, so that's shopping centers with supermarkets. We have a national presence, and our particular formula is wealthy, densely populated neighborhoods with little to no available space for competition. We will will gun for the leading grocery anchor and backpedal from there for the rest of the spaces in the center. Answer Amanda's question about what we were seeing pre and post recession. These days, we are really thankful that a lot of the discretionary spending went to necessity retail. So folks stopped eating out. They stopped buying things that they had duplicates of at home. And instead, they spent their money on food, on medicine, and everyday use items. So in that type of environment for real estate, for us at AMCAP, it meant for a fortunate capital raising process, but it was also a very long one, whereas in years past, we could devote 6 to 12 months to the process. In this instance, it was much more difficult to secure any type of decision-making from the groups that we were speaking to, and that institutional universe was really pension funds and endowments, domestic ones, a few international sovereign wealth funds as well, but it was primarily domestic. And so we were seeing a much more difficult capital raising environment in terms of the amount of time that it took. That aside, I would say that in our space right now, what we are seeing is a flight to size and a flight to core. It's not news that I think any of you would think is new, but we are seeing that there's a disproportionate interest in primary markets with leading anchors, there is a less of an interest in the B and C shopping centers, and those are the ones that are floundering today. But I'll reserve comments for the rest of this panel. Scott?
Sure. Again, I'm Scott Hileman. I'm a director with Deloitte in their financial advisory services. In talking through kind of where things were before and where things are now, I thought I'd give you kind of a little personal history here of where it was back in 2005 versus now. In 2005, I was actually the chief operating officer for Babcock & Brown's U.S. real estate group. And many of you may know Babcock, as they're kind of notorious now because they've completely blown up. People like to think of Australian investment in U.S. real estate as being kind of suckers and tend to overpay. And unfortunately, I have to agree with them, having lived through that experience now. But in 2005, our real estate portfolio in the U.S. at Babcock was zero. We had nothing. We owned nothing. And by 2007, our portfolio was $4.5 billion. So we went on a buying spree in a very short time period at the absolute peak of the market. And I can tell you, just to give you kind of a sense of what the market was like at that point, we used cheap CMBS debt to buy all of our assets. Everything was leveraged at a minimum of 90% loan to value. We were able to buy a book of loans that we planned to issue a CDO with absolutely no money. We had 100% financing through a line of credit with one of the major banks. So if you're buying at high leverage or no leverage, or actually with no equity, it doesn't give you a lot of room in case things start to go down. Our portfolio, unlike we keep hearing today, everybody wants core. We really focused on kind of Class B properties in secondary and tertiary markets, which again didn't give us much room whenever things kind of blew up. So again, we're getting further out on the tightrope here between our leverage and our markets and what have you. But we had a portfolio. We had shopping malls, which weren't as nice as Ed's. We had self-storage facilities, we had industrial properties, we had mezzanine loans, we had some really nice condo projects, which iStar actually was the lender on in Miami, Florida. Figure out how well those went.
Now the owner of.
Exactly, which they're now the owner of. So that's where we were. It was great while it lasted, but in 2007, of course, the world kind of came to an end at that point. And I spent the next 2 years really struggling with falling property values. Overall, our values on our properties went down 40%. The income on our properties went down an equivalent amount. So I spent a lot of time with special servicers begging for money, begging to restructure deals. We were to the point where, because it was a low interest rate environment still back in 2008 and 9, the properties were still servicing the debt, but we literally had not one extra dollar for anything. So we had an apartment portfolio in Houston, which got hit by a hurricane, and we couldn't even afford the deductible on the hurricane insurance. So I had to go back to the special servicer and beg them to basically defer debt service for a month so we had enough money to actually pay for the initial repairs from the hurricane. So that was quite the time period there in 2008 and 9. But learned a lot, and so based on that experience, today, kind of fast forward, I am at Deloitte, and actually Babcock is my client. So kind of turned it around on that side there. So we're actually helping them dispose of their remaining U.S. real estate assets at this point. The portfolio is still about $2.5 billion. Interestingly enough, the large banks that basically backed Babcock have sold off all their debt to hedge funds at about 20 cents on the dollar. So we have completely gone in and thrown the business plans out for all the assets, which was primarily liquidation. And now we're actually looking at holding on to certain types of assets, such as multifamily, where we think the market's going to continue to go up over the next couple of years. So we're still serving in a strategic advisory role for Babcock at this point. And that experience has been great for everything else that I'm doing kind of on the distress side for banks and investors and what have you. So from a lessons learned standpoint, I had a couple of lessons learned based on my experience here. First of all, if you take away one thing today, property values do go up and down. I could not convince the people at Babcock, whenever I was there, the values didn't keep going like this. We had a lot of young people, and I used to test them by going RTC, and I'd get this blank look, and then I'd be like, oh God, I gotta explain what's going on here. So property values go down. Second of all, leverage sometimes cannot be your friend. Just because somebody gives you 90% leverage doesn't mean you have to take it. So that wasn't a good thing there. Think about downside risk. While we were out accumulating assets as fast as we could, we never thought about what would happen if the world blew up. What would happen to the CMBS debt if we have to go in and restructure it? It took me months to figure out who the person was I was supposed to be speaking to at the special servicer, let alone to talk about the restructuring debts. And as long as the debt was being current, they didn't want to talk to me. So think about the downside risk there. Always have an exit strategy for your assets. We were buying stuff, and we didn't really have a plan for what we're going to do with them once we had them. So think about an exit strategy. And on a personal standpoint, always have an exit strategy for yourself, because if something goes wrong, you need to have a backup plan. So
that's great. One of the things that I wanted to cover today was the CMBS market, and I know that a lot of the panelists here have used CMBS, and I don't know if Mike or Ed, if you guys want to touch on what you think it will start to look like as the market returns, or what the dynamics are going to be going forward.
Well, I think that clearly CMBS rose at to a meteoric point. $200-300 billion worth of new issuances a year. I think everybody is, and I think as Scott pointed out, underwriting standards got fairly loose. You could get 90% financing at an all-in L plus 200, which let the top 5 to 10% of the capital stack get to 20s and 25s. Thank you very much for good leverage and compressed cap rates. It has started to make a comeback. I mean, all the original CMBS shops were basically liquidated. Some of those same characters have resurfaced with different business cards and are now, there's, I think some 20 shops up and running, issuing CMBS. The expectation, it's probably a $40 or $50 billion market this year. Even if it were to double next year into an $80 billion market, if you look at what the maturities are coming down the road, it's still a long way from filling that gap. And so while it might be a contributor of capital and a solution on some of the pending maturities, you're still going to have to look to some traditional sources like banks, like life insurance companies, and increasingly re-equitizing some of those real estate holdings. There's going to be more equity required. Not quite as much, because the likelihood is that some of those assets are going to trade down in value. So you're not replacing 100% of the capital stack. You might be replacing 80% of the capital stack, and somebody gets burned along the way. And it may be everybody that was in the capital stack before that. So I think our view is that it's going to come back. I think the original hope was it would come back and lend to conservative standards, income-producing property at reasonable loan to values based on current valuations. Some of the stuff that we were talking about even before this panel started is some of those hoped for standards are already getting loosened up, because the CMBS providers are all fighting for the same high-quality assets in urban markets. So they're tightening spreads, loosening underwriting conditions, starting to lend into pro formas again, and so maybe we have the makings of the same business we had. Congress was going to require that the issuers of CMBS had to retain 5%. It seems that may get waived a little bit, or that maybe not the issuer owns it, but as long as somebody else owns a 5% loss piece. Well, that's the old standard B piece, which was the original component of CMBS, and as the business got pretty successful, there was a B piece and a C piece and a D piece and an alphabet soup thereafter. And ultimately, a lot of those pieces got wiped out and are getting wiped out as those loans mature. But part of the problem, which was referred to, is you're still lending to an amorphous entity. An amorphous entity is lending you money, and when you need to go talk to somebody about a problem